So we are back on Makers today. We're talking to Reiko, and I'm Diego. We're looking into how we expand the conversation around the API and how do we use things like JSON, which is another question I had. So Ray, you and I already talked about APIs and how that works. Can you show me here how JSON comes into play?
Yeah. Okay. So before we get into how JSON comes into play, try to pick a color here that makes sense. So in the last video, presumably if we did it in order, we talked about APIs, like how it's about contracts or how you and I would talk to each other, how we agree upon talking to each other. How do I expose services that I will do on your behalf to you, and how can I guarantee if you talk to me or provide me information a certain way, I can guarantee you to get information back a certain way, right? So JSON. So it's great. We created a contract between us. If you talk to me, I'll give you things back a certain way. There's usually in between we have to talk about like what's the format that's going to take. Like what is the data structure or the format that you're going to give it to me? Is it going to be are you going to write a letter to me like physically on paper, right? Is it going to be Morse code? Is it going to be you're going to throw a rock through my window with the note attached to it, right? In a certain we have to agree upon this as well. And so in our world, there are a lot of different formats that we can use, and it's not necessarily human readable, right? It's usually machine readable, so a computer can make sense of it. There are a number of different formats, and the one that typically has won over the last, let's call it the greater part of last decade, not 2 decades, something called JSON, right? So JSON. Um, you can go through the history. There's a lot of content out there about it, but basically this is a JavaScript Object Notation. So that's what the JSON stands for. Not JSON like Jason Voorhees. Like
Oh,
every, every,
yeah.
everyone makes this joke, right? So nothing new there. That's an old joke, but that's what JSON is. It's basically a structure, a way to represent the information that I want, and you're gonna see it. Let me maybe move off over here on this for a little bit. You're gonna see it in a format like this. So there's something a very popular language or scripting language out there called JavaScript, and they created a way to represent information in a very specific manner. In particular, you're gonna see these. I've heard the name for this a number of times. Squiggly brackets, carriage braces, whatever
Yeah,
you want to call it.
curly.
Yeah, curly braces, right? It's basically my handwriting is very poor, but it's basically if I do it slower, it's basically this character that you see on your keyboard, right? Or basically the opening and closing version of it like this. Looks like the profile of someone's face, right? So, anyways, it starts off with that, and within this, you're gonna see certain what we call key values represented in here. So like it might have something called first name, kind of borrowing from our last video, um, and then someone's name. I really feel like maybe we should do this in the text editor, but hey, we already got the whiteboard going. But basically, this object represents information about something, right? So last name, it says last name, regardless of my handwriting, it says last name. KAO or Co, which is my last name. And this object, this data format represents the information you're going to send to me, right? It's going to be in this JSON format. So this is what JSON is. So this is a format that one is relatively human readable, right? There's some weird stuff in here, in terms of its syntax. These carriage braces that open and close it. We have to define things wrapped in quotation marks, double quotation marks for it. We have a key, which is like the property name. So first name and last name are property names or keys. And then we have values that they're associated with, right? And you'll notice also instead of an equal sign, right, we have these
So you have a
colons,
column in there.
yeah,
Yeah.
to represent it. And then everything in here, if we have more items, we have to separate them with commas, right? So like a sentence, like here's my first value, comma, my second key value, right, that we're going to do. And it goes on, and it can get more complicated. We can have nested objects within here. We can have a list of things. That is a class on its own, but here's the big picture, right? I want you to send me JSON, right? Other APIs, other backends, they may want you to send it in a different format. If you work in Excel, right, you've seen things like comma separated values to represent like a Excel or a spreadsheet, tab separated values. Maybe I just want you to send it to me in clear text, right? But as part of that API that it'll describe in the documentations, I hope, if I wrote if I wrote documentation, or if I wrote my documentation well, good documentation, I'll tell you that I expect it as JSON. Now, the cool thing about a Power App, right, as someone who uses Power Apps, I'll go back to this diagram, is that kind of information that, establishing the format that you should be sending it to me in is actually done by um, potentially someone else. And when I say potentially someone else, I mean, we're going to come back to the idea. I'm going to circle these things here, these custom connectors. These are the pieces that, okay, Diego, you're our maker. You're our Power App developer. You're the person who's going to be making this thing on the far, oops, one color, on the far. That still didn't switch. Blue. I want blue. Okay. On this far left hand side, this is you. So the person in between us, me being the back end in the middle, creates the custom connector, custom data connector, data connector. You might hear this. They're the ones who are going to be the bridge between the two of us. So you're free to make your application, via, the standard format of writing Power Apps, that there are actions or methods that you can call in order to save data or call a backend, right? Some connector elsewhere. So the match between, is it JSON, is it XML, the details of that, you as a maker on the left hand side, you shouldn't really
So
care.
I shouldn't really care about that, right? Like
No.
I want to understand it's just part of a dialogue here. But I really that lies outside of probably what I've initially would be doing, right? I mean, I'm in the UI. I am configuring these text boxes, and I'm sending this over through a custom connector that you developed. So I really don't want to look into anything other than that, right?
That's it. Yeah, that's right. Because you know that if I call this particular action, maybe it's again the write action, like WRIT of this particular custom data connector, that it will, translate this, create that JSON object on my behalf, and send it over to me over the internet, and I will get it as the backend developer, that backend
But
API.
I think that the other interesting thing here is folks might eventually want to learn these other pieces. They may want to learn how to actually do their own custom connector. So definitely learning what JSON is and what you can do with it, I think will come as something that is beneficial for them as they're learning about Power Apps.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's a progression, right? Like, first we'll start off with making something that I can visually see and understand, and work within its sort of programming paradigm, its own language, its own syntax, and then we'll eventually graduate and probably create a custom connector to something. Our colleagues have created a number of custom connectors to things like
That's right.
Star Wars API that someone else made out there, that's out on the internet, that they didn't even create. They just knew about. They created a custom connector that someone else could actually use and consume.
And then maybe one last question I have here. You might also be receiving back your information as JSON, right?
That's
That
right.
might also be something that could happen here.
In theory, yeah. In theory, it could be some kind of like bi-directional, like a two-way communication between your application and my backend application, and a custom connector. In theory, like there are ways to go about it, be brokering that on both of our behalves, right? So if I just write to the custom connector, or write to some endpoint the custom connector knows to or knows about, or maybe it's constantly asking me, polling me, like, hey, you got new information, you got new information. I'll be like, yes, here it is, and then it can provide it back to you on your behalf.
Sounds good. You've answered all my questions then.
Okay, great. Well, until next time.
Well, thank you. Until next time.